In 2008, the Holy Land Foundation and several of its senior leaders were convicted of funneling more than $12 million to Hamas, with the jury finding the defendants guilty on all counts of the indictment. While the Holy Land Foundation was brought to justice, the Obama administration refused to investigate the list of 246 unindicted co-conspirators presented as evidence by the prosecution. On February 17th of this year, my colleagues and I authored a letter asking Attorney General Sessions to reopen the investigation into the unindicted co-conspirators listed in the largest terrorist financing trial in our nation's history, which is the United States versus the Holy Land Foundation for Relief and Development et al. At this time, I ask unanimous consent that this be submitted for the record.
Without objection.
So I think my first question will go to Mr. Jocelyn. Wahhabi ideology is essentially the wellspring of the doctrine and worldviews of radical Islamic terrorist organizations, or Islamism, or fundamentalism, or whatever you folks feel comfortable with calling it, in general, and of ISIS in particular. I know you're often focused on al-Qaeda, but I know that you're well-versed in ISIS as well, and the general theme. Many of ISIS's official publications are classic works of the Wahhabi canon, and ISIS ideologues and supporters regularly liken the so-called caliphate to the first Saudi Wahhabi state. Since 1979, Saudi Arabia has engaged in a persistent and consistent campaign of exporting Wahhabi ideology throughout the Muslim world, spending about $4 billion annually on mosques, madrasas, preachers, students, and textbooks. Wahhabi ideology has become so prominent in the Muslim world that by 2013, 75% of North American Islamic centers relied on Wahhabi preachers who promote anti-Western ideas in person and online through their sermons and through the Saudi-produced literature. So the question is, what role does the export of Wahhabism by Saudi Arabia play in the radicalization of Muslims, whether it be in regard to ISIS, al-Qaeda, Boko Haram, or otherwise, both at home and abroad, and in grooming them for recruitment by terrorist organizations?
Well, Wahhabi extremism is an issue in a lot of ways. I mean, in the areas where the funding goes to fund those mosques or madrasas, it oftentimes runs roughshod over local Islamic traditions, basically replaced by this extremist version of Islam. But in terms of ISIS and al-Qaeda, we also have to be careful a little bit, where ISIS in particular has basically draws on ideas outside of the Wahhabi realm quite often, and has actually turned its rhetorical guns and is trying to turn its literal guns on the Saudi kingdom on a regular basis. Same thing with al-Qaeda. I mean, you know, part of why the Saudis have intervened in Yemen, for example, is they were worried both about the Houthi rebellion there and also on the al-Qaeda side. So there is a story to be told on Saudi funding of extremism for sure. I think it's a problem. It's not the version of Islam that I think most Muslims around the world are used to or know. It's not part of the regular customs. And I've seen complaints everywhere from Nigeria through North Africa, through East Africa, all the way into South Asia, of where when the Saudis turn on the spigot, basically a very different version of sort of Islam shows up. And I think it's very careful. We should be very careful about tracking that and understanding that. To your point about the terrorism finance, Congressman, I would second the idea that any specific violations of terrorist finance laws need to be investigated and prosecuted here in the U.S. I think I'm aware that there's been a slow roll on that issue. And the way I think about the world is in terms of very specific threats and very specific ties to terrorists. And if there are organizations here in the U.S. which are engaging in that sort of fundraising activity, once again, they should be investigated and prosecuted.
So just kind of following up on your discussion about most Muslims, and I would agree with you that most Muslims eschew or reject the Wahhabi or the strict structural, fundamental form of Wahhabism that is put upon them. But I still am concerned about oftentimes the high percentage of Muslims worldwide, and most peaceful Muslims. Let's just be clear here; they're the ones that are put upon by this ideology and most of the reign of terror, if you will, by the Wahhabists or Islamists. But many of the world's Muslim population, and including the United States, sees Sharia, which is oftentimes as well associated with Wahhabism, is perfectly okay and appropriate to live under. And so in a circumstance where many of the occupants might not like the kind of the outcome of living under those circumstances. They don't really disagree with it fundamentally when questioned. What do you make of that?
Well, as a secular humanist, I'm certainly no fan of Sharia law. But I'll say this, Sharia means different things within the Muslim community. There isn't one interpretation or meaning of that, and that's not a cop-out or apologia for it. It really, Sharia can mean a number of different things. What I think you're concerned about, or what I'd be concerned about, are organizations that basically say that Sharia law should supplant sort of American customs or American ideas and principles. And I think that's something that needs to be contested in the court of public opinion and exposed and sort of debated, is basically the way I would handle that more often than not. I don't think, just because an individual Muslim necessarily adheres to Sharia, it may not mean the version of Sharia that is sort of totalitarian or sort of wants to supplant American customs. It may mean something much more local and personal. I certainly know, Muslims in the New York, New Jersey area who will tell you they're Sharia compliant, and yet they don't believe in Muslim Brotherhood ideology or, Al-Qaeda's ideology or ISIS or anything like that. So what I would look at is basically organizations that sort of advocate a version of that is sort of totalitarian in nature and contest it in the court of public opinion.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.